I'll call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. Committee, there's an agenda before us. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Mr. Natalie, all those in favor? Motion carried. Agenda is adopted. Declaration of conflicts of interest. Hearing none, we'll move on to today's item of business, public hearing on Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act, and Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. I'll begin by providing some opening comments, and then we will move to public submissions. Welcome to all of you and all of you watching at home for our meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. I'll start by asking members of the committee to introduce themselves for the record, and we'll start with Mr. Simpson.
Good evening, R.J. Simpson, MLA for Hay River North. Welcome.
Good evening, Danny McNeely, Satu.
Good evening, Michael Nudd, MLA for Detroit. Welcome.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
And I am Kieran Testart, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. With me at the table are April Taylor, our committee research advisor, and Ms. Jennifer Frankie Smith, our committee clerk. Today, the Standing Committee on Government Operations is holding a public hearing on two bills before the committee. Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act, and Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act. The Standing Committee on Government Operations is a committee of regular members of the Legislative Assembly. The bills we are reviewing today were introduced by the Minister of Finance, given first and second reading in the Legislative Assembly, and then referred to this Standing Committee for review. It is our responsibility as a standing committee to consult with residents of the Northwest Territories on what they like or don't like about the bills. We would like to hear your views and comments tonight, which will be used by the committee to identify any changes we would like to see made to this draft legislation, and which we will then report back to our colleagues in the Legislative Assembly. I wish to briefly describe the intent of the bill. Bill 42, an act to amend the Petroleum Products Tax Act, amends the Petroleum Products Tax Act to clarify that all existing provisions in the act related to the current fuel tax are noted as such, impose a carbon tax on petroleum products and natural gas, to provide an exemption from the fuel tax for petroleum products delivered to or purchased by an Indian or Indian band on a reserve, or used by a designated municipal authority that is recognized by the minister as representing a community, make the necessary amendments for collection and administration of this tax in the same manner as the current fuel tax. For example, purchasers will be required to pay the tax, and vendors and collectors are required to remit the tax to the government of the Northwest Territories. Allow the minister to provide in regulations for rebates and grants. Increase the maximum fines and penalties, which may be imposed as administrative penalties or on summary conviction, and set out a process for the appeal of an assessment of tax, interest, or administrative penalties under the Act. Bill 43, an act to amend the Income Tax Act, amends the Income Tax Act to provide a cost of living offset as a mechanism for returning carbon tax revenues to Northwest Territories residents, make changes in non-refundable tax credits claimed by multi-jurisdictional tax filers, including changes that restrict the Northwest Territories pension credit to NWT residents, and changes that allow full pension and dividend credits to be claimed by Northwest Territories residents with business income earned outside of the Northwest Territories. There are copies of the bills and Government of the Northwest Territories plain language summaries on the side table. If you'd like to share your views with us today, please let our clerk know by raising your hand, and we'll be sure to get you on the list. And one final piece of housekeeping. Remember that all submissions will be part of official committee records and may be reflected in our final report. Any submissions made during this meeting may also be televised or broadcast via social media. And as for our rules of show here tonight, members of the public who present will be given 20 minutes to present, and members of the committee who are asking questions will be given 10-minute blocks of time to work with. Thank you, everyone, for your patience in allowing this introduction. With members' agreement, we can now open the floor to comments from the public. Do members agree? Agreed. Thank you, committee. Would Ms. Brown, would you like to approach the witness table? Please introduce yourself for the record, and then you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. My name is Sarah Brown. I'm the CEO of the NWT Association of Communities, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to present to you this evening. We have been, like all of you, waiting to see what is going to happen with the carbon tax and what it's going to look like. I'm going to highlight a few things for you. First of all, you will have all received our presentation materials, and they are contain our comments on really just on Bill 42, 43 with respect to the Income Tax Act. Thank you. We do not have any comments at this time. Just so you know, the NWT Association of Communities represents all 33 communities within the Northwest Territories. And in particular, I would draw your attention to the two resolutions that were that were dealt with at our AGM this February. They speak to two elements, both carbon pricing and the sharing of data. Sharing of energy data has long been an issue for over 10 years that I've been involved with energy planning. There has been a challenge with getting the data. It's very hard to do community energy plans without that data. How do you set your goals, benchmark whether you're meeting them, all of those things. So I know that we've been assured through our resolution process that in fact that will be dealt with the new act, so that's really great. With respect to the carbon tax piece, municipal governments or local governments or community governments, however you wish to describe them, are not going to be revenue neutral in this process. Despite many assurances to that effect to date, we would be getting the heating fuel rebate along with everybody else. We certainly would enjoy the aviation fuel the exemption that they're going to have. We will enjoy the fact that the NTPC rates are not going to be increased because of this tax. However, there is no equivalent to the COLO, which is the cost of living offset, that is going to be accorded to individual residents. When we asked why and how that was going to be dealt with, we were told you'll just have to increase your taxes, which means then it's not revenue neutral to anyone in the territory then, because that has to be passed on, whether it's increased user fees or it's increased property taxes or it's a drop in level of service. It's all of our residents that will pay. So our communities are already underfunded to the tune of 37%. They do not have any resilience, for want of a better word, to absorb these sorts of increases. So the reality of it is that we would be passing those taxes on to our residents. So it's not just the municipalities, it's everyone that would be impacted. We generally are supportive of the carbon tax. We know that we need to secure funds and raise funds, and we encourage that it stay circles back and it is all this money is recycled in sustainable projects. We certainly want to see that, but that lack of that not being revenue neutral will definitely impact not only on municipalities but on all citizens of the territory. So also wanted to respectfully request that there needs to be a lot of attention to how this gets communicated, no matter what the outcomes are. We've had situations before where there was some communications going to some groups and not to others who were being treated differently with a tax credit, and that created a lot of issues, and so the communications plan is really critical with this. People are asking lots of questions on the street. I'm getting lots of questions from the communities going, what's happening? And they obviously can't follow this to the same extent that we do. So, and we've been asking finance to communicate with them, and they have been reluctant until these decisions are made. So I think that communication piece is absolutely critical once the decisions are made. So again, I would highlight our primary conclusions are that The ongoing monitoring of the effectiveness of this program is absolutely critical. To just do it and assume it's going to have all the outcomes we hope for wouldn't be smart. If it is having negative impacts in other areas that we didn't anticipate, or if it's having great positive impacts, then we should know it, and it should be transparent, and we should be able to see that. That communities either need to be rebated for the taxes that they're paying, or they need an increased funding transfer for their O&M to offset it, one or the other. And that, again, the communication piece is so critical, so that everybody understands what's going to be happening. And I thank you for this opportunity to present to you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Could you give us some more detail in the data sharing piece of your submission, Ms. Brown?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, one of the issues has been when you're doing energy planning, you have to set your benchmarks. You need to have an understanding of where different fuels are being used, how they're being used, and both from a corporate perspective, but also from the community perspective. And we have not been able to date very consistently secure that data. Even though it all goes through the territorial government, we were cited that it was a privacy issue. And now we're given to understand that it will now be dealt with and will be circulated through the Bureau of Statistics. And as long as it's going to be available, that's great. So I just didn't want that to get lost in all of this, that hopefully the carbon tax is helping to address that data gap.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. So I'll just speak generally to some of the recommendations you're asking for, or the conclusions of the NWTAC. And I think the key component to this carbon pricing scheme in the Northwest Territories, or in Canada via the federal backstop, is how the rebate system works, how the reporting and monitoring works, all of these kind of policy issues. The bills before the committee right now do not address those policy details. Most of that has been decided by the government outside of the legislative review process, and that has been communicated through various fora, such as the Department of Finance's website. They've undertaken an advertising campaign, and that's where some of the details are coming out. Again, that is the government's prerogative to communicate its plans. This committee, however, has been engaged since day one of carbon pricing, and has had several opportunities to have presentations provided to the committee on how it's going to work. We've provided feedback to the minister and the department on what we feel is an effective carbon pricing regime in the Northwest Territories. I think however, our desires to see that level of improvement haven't always panned out, and right now we're left in the uncomfortable position of having minimal influence over the details of carbon pricing that Northerners care most about. It's our great regret that we could only have this opportunity to speak to the public, but we felt it important to give that opportunity, and we appreciate that you are here tonight. But this is a much larger issue that we will be addressing further as we move down the legislative process into the coming sitting. So we will take your feedback and carefully consider it, and the feedback of all the communities you represent. And I'll now turn the floor over to members of the committee if they have any questions. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions for clarification. I thank you for the presentation. You mentioned a couple things, that you were given assurances that carbon tax would be neutral for municipalities, that NTPC rates wouldn't increase as a result of this. I was wondering, who is giving you those assurances? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown?
That was always the understanding we were given with it, that this is revenue neutral, and it's certainly, on the surface of it, is revenue neutral for residents until you say, well, but their municipal taxes are going to go up. But when you look at the residents in isolation, then yes, they are revenue neutral. The other piece was on the energy piece, the data piece. They actually replied to our resolution that they would be addressing that through this process.
And by they, you mean officials
The
from
government,
GWT?
yes, yeah.
Mr. Simpson?
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that the federal government's plan was to not make it revenue neutral and charge people more so than they would reduce consumption, I guess, right? And yeah, I'm not even sure if it's revenue neutral for residents because, the price of everything will go up. People have to truck in goods, and so the price of those will go up. And as well with NTPC, I don't believe that the fuel to generate power will be, the tax will apply, but, NTPC's costs will go up. So that all gets charged back to the ratepayer. So I was just wondering, because, we talk a lot about messaging in here, and so there seems to be mixed messages coming from, not unclear messaging, I guess, coming from all sides. So that's it for now. I just want some clarification, so I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. And it should be noted that revenue neutral, cost neutral and revenue neutral are discrete concepts, and one of the most effective carbon pricing models that we have in Canada is the British Columbia model, which is there's a policy commitment from the BC government that it be revenue neutral, and that means every dollar raised in revenue is reinvested either in the economy or into energy retrofits, those kind of things. And largely that is guided by 5-year tax plans. Those are not aspects of this plan, but cost neutral is certainly a different concept, which means, you're not paying any more with the imposition of the tax. There are many exemptions that are built into the GNWT scheme, and that's on, Mr. Simpson mentioned heating fuel. There's also aviation fuel. But where residents will receive a cost of living offset. But of course, you still pay at the pump. That is fully realized in this bill, that's where the majority of the tax revenue is going to be raised, is on motive fuels. So just for clarification. Sorry to put you in the spot, but it's an opportunity
Absolutely.
to speak to the public on what we know about the scheme so far.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the committee? Mr. McNeely.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for coming this evening there to make a presentation here and answer questions here. As you mentioned, your communications should be there. I'm just wondering, have you had some discussions with the government, the Department of Finance in particular? If you go on their website, there's files in there to show the implementation of the tax. Have you had some engagements with the department on that communication from them to your members? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown.
Thank you very much. We have tried to encourage them to be communicating with our members, but they declined until after this legislation is finished, its process. So then we went to MACA, and we've been having ongoing discussions with MACA, because how do you budget? How do you plan? Any of those things. How do you do that without knowing what the impacts are? And in particular, it was very concerned earlier this year when it was looking at a July 1 implementation, that's when very early in the budget cycle for communities, and it could have very significant impact on them. So we have been lobbying pretty hard, and we are very happy to assist with that communication with communities. And anything we can do to help that get out, whether it's using our e-news and our networks that we have, we'd be very happy to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. McNeely?
That's it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Anything further from committee? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for your presentation this evening. Mentioned that you had received specific responses in writing to the two motions that are attached to your submission. Would you be able to share those responses with the committee through our clerk? Thanks.
Ms. Brown?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, I think that I would find that helpful to find out how our cabinet colleagues are responding to municipal issues. You did mention, of course, that municipal governments are not going to get all of the carbon tax back that they have to pay for heating of municipal buildings, fleets that they use.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry, you're right.
Ms. Brown, you wanted to clarify?
Yeah, I believe they will get heating, because everybody will get an immediate credit at a pump, for want of a better word, but not on the others.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, certainly, a non-motive, motive fuels used in vehicles and so on, you won't get a rebate for those. Have you received any, or you had any discussions with MACA about the potential to increase municipal budgets or municipal funding to deal with this increased cost? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, certainly that is one of the alternatives. We've had discussions with MACA about that. It really is part of forest growth then.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Any commitments from MACA to do more than talk about it? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, not at this point. And particularly when it's on top of already having a very significant gap in our funding for O&M already. But it has been discussed as a way to work through that.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the response. I think in our upcoming sitting, we may get I think we're supposed to get a plan for how they're going to start to plan to close the municipal funding gap. So this may play into that discussion on the floor of the House in a week and a bit. But any concerns or commitments from, say, Department of Infrastructure with regard to reinvesting any of the carbon tax revenues that are retained by government for, community energy planning purposes, or helping to, basically lower the cost of living for folks in communities? Thanks.
Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Reading between the lines of the materials that have been presented to date, it's roughly 40 million that would be raised, and roughly 40 million would be the territorial government's commitment to the 25% of the major energy projects that they're talking about taking on. I believe there's a list of about 11 of them. So it hasn't been stated categorically, but that's my understanding, that that's where those funds would go, which does not leave anything left over for talking about that reinvestment at more of a local level, like energy planning. There are a significant volume of funds currently being administered by Arctic Energy Alliance that are providing some assistance with that, but communities are always looking for funding to move ahead with their doing and implementing their energy plans.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that. One more question, maybe two. Did you have any specific comments on, changes to the bills themselves? And, I'm respectful of the chair's comments in terms of our ability to actually change the legislation itself is very limited, because there's very few details contained in here other than saying, here's what the tax is going to be. There will be a mechanism to provide rebates and grants that we may not have any input into, communities or regular MLAs or the public. And by the way, there's going to be some changes to the Income Tax Act to provide individuals that file tax returns the ability to get a cost of living increase credit. So that's all that's in here. All of the things, a lot of the issues that you've said are really outside the scope of the bills in terms of monitoring, reporting, reinvestment, and so on. But any specific changes that you'd like to see in that legislation itself? Thanks.
Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, we're really focused around the first principles that are leading to it, and that really obvious gap of not rebating municipalities for fuel use. So yeah, I was happy to see. I think there was a bit of a housekeeping change relative to defining a municipality and a municipal-like organization. That has been the practice to date, but I think it was good to see it tidied up there. So, no, we didn't really have anything there because there's no meat in there. It's all hanging off of the act and regulations and practice.
Thank you, Ms. Brand. And that's the codifying the designated authority relationship that some Indigenous bands have in
Yeah, and that's only
municipalities.
one in the territory.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. I think that's all I had, but I share presenters' frustration that many of the issues that are important to our residents are outside the scope of these bills, and we may not have the ability to influence that as much as we would like. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Anything, Mr. McNeely?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. You had mentioned earlier that it's hard to do community energy planning and so on with these unknowns. This tax bill has been talked about for a number of months, and I'm just wondering what preliminary discussions have you had in reducing fossil fuels with the members with the member communities?
Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've long worked on the energy file because it's important. We've generally focused on it from a business case perspective, but we try to help communities. We try to put them in touch with wayfinders that can help them too, because often the community is very well intentioned, but they just don't have the resources and people resources or the dollars, and so we try to connect them with that. We included a lot on energy at our recent climate change conference as well, where we tried to help people connect with those catalysts and hopefully get them and hearing what others are doing. But it's a really tricky file right now with all the uncertainty, and just not even, I've often said, I wouldn't even know where to send you other than Arctic Energy Alliance. Because we started to pull together even a list of all the funds, and it was pages and pages long. But we didn't always fit in them. As you know, many of the challenges with lots of these funds, they get written from a southern perspective, and then we don't always fit in them. So it is an ongoing challenge, and is not one that's going to go away anytime soon. And we've actually met on numerous occasions with the federal government departments that have many different funds out there to try to talk to them about, come see us before you design the programs, and we can help make them accessible to you, and that they need to look at a one-window approach. And their answer is like, well, we have a one-door approach. And it's like, well, so they get to run around in circles as you move them from one to another. We're like, no, somebody needs to be able to come in with a challenge or an idea, and you're going to walk them all the way through the process. So we are trying to help pull all those pieces together and work with Arctic Energy Alliance on that.
Mr. McNeely?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for your response here. Just to help you share some awarenesses of what other communities are doing. I was quite surprised here in communicating with Delaney, the community that is in my riding here, and they're sponsoring a Delaney Community Energy Planning Workshop on August the 6th in Delaney, to review the various sources, initiatives, and programs that are out there, including solar panels, wood pellets, just to name a couple, and the biomass systems. So that's one community, what they've taken the initiative to do. And I don't know if they've had some support or requests from your office to hold that workshop to analyze their options available and the sources outside of Arctic Energy Alliances. I'm just visualizing, on another opportunity. If each community, I'm thinking about the or the Hamlet complex in Toledo, and I'm just wondering what assistance your office is providing Toledo to be more energy efficient in that building,
Right.
including pellet biomass source heating. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown?
We don't assist directly, for example, on a project like that. We can't do that because we have 33 members, then we are perceived as a bias to one community or another. So what we try to do is facilitate people meeting and starting to make those connections. Arctic Energy Alliance, I know, is helping a lot of communities do projects just like you're describing. We recommend, we do talk about things like doing, so if you were building a new town hall or community complex, that you should do an analysis about what the extra investment at the front end will save you over the lifespan. So you do a real life cycle costing. So yes, you may have higher capital costs, but you know that it's going to save you over the long term. And we've developed a lot of tools to help do those sorts of things. But yeah, there are lots of wayfinders and catalyst groups out there that will help communities do that. And we try to connect them up. That's really our role, is to try to connect them.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one last comment. On the principles of fossil fuel reductions, on the members that you represent, I'm thinking, rather than asking for more money, let's work with the communities on reducing what they currently have. Things like we do in our own homes, or most of us do, or some of us do. Triple pane windows, for example. Or the hot water system. The most common one now is that water on demand, rather than having to heat up your elements in the hot water tank 24/7. It just heats up on the minute you turn the taps. Those types of availability on cost reduction is what I'm thinking should be communicated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown, to care to
Thank you,
respond?
Mr. Chair. Yes, absolutely. Efficiency has always got to be your first goal before you start talking about renewables and everything. First is that efficiency piece, and we really strongly encourage that. And we actually, through a series of projects with Arctic Energy Alliance that we did, we actually got 10 audits done. And then we were able to start seeing patterns too. So how could we assist them? So we ended up doing LED lights and automated thermostats in 8 of those 10 communities. We actually issued the tender. We worked with the Arctic Energy Alliance to issue the tenders, get the contractors, everything, because it's not that they didn't want to do these things. There's just not enough hours. And it's not realistic to expect the senior administrative officer or the roads foreman to get up to speed enough to issue a tender to get some of those changes done. So wherever we can, we try to put people together to, as you said, to focus on those efficiency pieces first and do that first, because the paybacks are often a year or 2 years. They're not great big expensive things, and they don't take 10 or 15 years to pay back.
Mr. McNeely?
Nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, some of what Ms. Brown said earlier made me think back 20 years ago. I was a city councillor for Yellowknife, and I got involved with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Jack Layton chaired a committee that I sat on where municipalities across the country worked together to basically develop the rationale, the plan for the municipal green funds that were seen as a way to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and probably one of the best investments of money to do that. And I firmly believe that communities can do that work here as well. So. But I'm just wondering whether the FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, has a position on the carbon tax, and whether they've done any analysis around the impacts on municipal governments, and whether you may be able to share that with committee. And if you can't do it right now, if you could look at helping us out understanding that, I think that'd be helpful. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brown?
Mr. Chair. I have seen some stuff on it, but I'm not sure if it's public or not, and but I can go back and confirm that and send that off to the committee when I get back.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. That'd be appreciated. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks.
Anything further? Well, thank you. On behalf of the committee, thank you very much, Ms. Brown, for presenting. You certainly opened our eyes to a lot of the discussions that have been happening between municipalities and the government of the Northwest Territories that we haven't been privy to, and it's been greatly educational. And we always appreciate you and hearing your input on the laws of the land. Would you like to provide any closing comments?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the constraints that the committee's working under, but felt it was still very important for us to highlight the other stuff that we're hearing outside of the acts and how they relate to our member municipalities and the residents of the Northwest Territories. So I do appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Brown.
Thank you.
Yeah, you may be excused.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to provide a submission to the committee? Or does anyone have questions for the committee? Because we're happy to explain what we know about the government's plans, keeping in mind that this is not our legislation. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. With nothing further, I will, on behalf of the committee, thank everyone who joined us today. As MLAs, it's always a privilege to hear from members of the public and hear directly from Northerners on the laws and policies that their government is presenting. We will make our report in the upcoming sitting of the Legislative Assembly, and will highlight the feedback we have received both during this hearing and the written submissions we've received to date. If you still have questions about the bill or want to make a written submission, you can speak to our committee clerk, and you can also visit our website, www.assembly.gov.nt.ca, and we'll be happy to take your thoughts into our deliberations. I will now adjourn this public meeting. Thank you very much.